Is the death penalty within the state order, whether by divine right or constitutional right, compatible or incompatible with Christianity? Non-Christians are wonderfully adept at exploiting the scruples and complexes of a confused and sentimental Christianity, while Christians get the impression that they are responding in kind to the ideological cliches of secular civilization. Christians and atheists disagree on a multitude of matters, and it is only natural for it to be so. But when it comes to the death penalty, or the wars once waged in the name of the cross, in hoc signa vinces, they all suddenly find themselves, supposedly, in a harmony of ideas and tolerant and pacifistic attitudes. The atheist believes himself to be at the peak of democratic humanitarianism, while the Christian believes he is at the peak of spiritual morality. As the saying goes, I rise to the peak of your beauty. And if any Christian happens to step out of line regarding historical truth, bringing up the heads chopped off or put in nooses by the Orthodox kings of Byzantium, the presence of military saints in the Synaxaria, the Holy Wars, the Crusades, the Inquisition, or a certain saint quick to shed innocent blood, etc., then those who rush first to correct him are his very own Christian brothers, either out of sincere, brainless tenderness, out of a mechanical adoption of thought patterns, or, most often, confessed or not, out of fear of seeing their fate once again slapped with the stigmatizing labels of fanaticism, fundamentalism, or religious obscurantism. With the Crusades and the Inquisition, it is easily settled. You pin them on Roman Catholicism as papist abuses, for which the Seraphic Orthodox East, guided by monastic spirituality, feels neither attached nor responsible. It becomes harder when it comes to Orthodox and Imperial Byzantium, an Ivan the Terrible, or the official radicalisms of Russian Orthodoxy's pan-Slavism, both in terms of justice and warfare, right up until the Bolsheviks took over the baton. But it is hardest of all when it comes to the Romanian deeply Orthodox national history, the lack of humanism in the old codes of law, the bellicose impulses not only against foreign invaders, but often against brothers of blood and faith, how church and monastery founding voivodes and boyars slaughtered one another with or without trial, the judicial rigorism of Vlad the Impaler, the real one, not the pseudo-mythologized Dracula, the quickness to anger of the right-believing voivode Stephen the Great and Holy, Athleta Christi, a great legal, but also without trial, chopper of unbowed heads, as the chronicler Ureke and others attest, the radical action of Michael the Brave in 1594, when he got rid of all his Levantine creditors by locking them in a church and putting them to fire and sword, or closer to our own times, the claims to sacrificial Christianity made by a vindictive legionarism. It is hard because, whether we like it or not, this is Christian history, and we have no other. Christianity, in whose name most people have declared and continue to declare themselves opposed to the death penalty, has known and permitted it throughout its entire history, not only in the extreme form of the Western Inquisition, which Orthodoxy has always disavowed, but even within the current legislation of all Christian empires and states, starting with Orthodox Byzantium, the unchallenged model of jurisdiction and statehood by divine right. The question arises, Is today's world more Christian than the medieval world? Might we not be dealing with a confusion, more or less intentional, between the rigors of Christianity, from which we have distanced ourselves, and the ideological or sentimental precepts of secular humanitarianism, with which we are saturated? In the absence of direct references in the New Testament, theologians ought to tell us, prior to their personal opinions as decent human beings, whether the patristic tradition pronounces itself specifically and clearly on this matter. The simple, universal invocation of the evangelical precept that God desires not the death of a sinner, but his repentance, does not cover the complexity of this issue. For God, for reasons sometimes evident, other times hidden, does not desire many things. Yet he still permits them within the imperfect interval of history: confessional secessions, wars, plagues, deprivation of liberty, divorces, etc. If I declare the 2,000-year history of Christianity to be condemnable and odious on the grounds that it routinely approved and practiced the death penalty, war, or whatever other form of intolerance, perceived today as politically incorrect, if I refuse to take historical Christianity as a reference point, considering it obsolete and riddled with sins that are unacceptable today, if I critically distance myself from my own tradition and stand ready, out of a sense of shame or even guilt, to disavow it alongside the irreducible enemies of the cross, then how am I any different in relation to the 2,000-year Christian paradigm from Jews, Masons, atheists, from communist, neo-communist, and globalist ideologies, from certain Protestant and neo-Protestant heresies, from ideologized pseudo-ecumenism, or from New Age pseudo-spiritualisms? For it must be one of two things: either Christianity embodied in history, from the Romano-Byzantine Empire to the last attempts at Christian statehood, represents a disgusting failure and a hereditary guilt for those who still assume it today, or my own faculties and frameworks of understanding have become perverted, and I must therefore take heed and reconsider certain convictions that may be too superficial and certain assertions that may be too hasty. Leaving aside the Old Testament, where the death penalty is found almost everywhere as the letter of the law, which was often amended by Christ himself, even if in other respects, I am taking into account only the New Testament, which, Christianly speaking, is beyond all doubt. In the Gospels, the death penalty is mentioned in passing several times, but it is never actually called into question, not even when the Sanhedrin decides on its application through the situational intermediary of Roman power, in the case of Jesus. At the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord invokes the old commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," putting it in its foundational place among the duties and demands of brotherly coexistence, without any extrapolation from the individual plane to the plane of condemnation, of which, both by divine and human justice, the murderer becomes worthy. Christ says so. In the economy of daily life, the moral law with personal application and responsibility is one thing, and the juridical law with public application and responsibility is another. They can meet, and it is good that they do, but they are not to be confused, as they have different foundations and purposes. It is no paradox that a transgression in the moral order, killing, can be, as it has been throughout history, a law in the juridical order, the death penalty. I am not saying it is good or bad. I am merely saying it is not a paradox, unless we confuse the reference planes. The only evangelical episode from which some have tried to draw certain conclusions on this topic remains that of the adulterous woman whom Christ saved from stoning. And the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. They put her in front of the crowd. "Teacher," they said to Jesus, "this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say?" They were trying to trap him into saying something they could use against him, but Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with his finger. They kept demanding an answer, so he stood up again and said, "All right, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone." Then he stooped down again and wrote in the dust. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, "Where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you?" "No, Lord," she said. And Jesus said, "Neither do I. Go and sin no more." Jesus does not therefore debate the punishment itself as prescribed by the law, but rather the moral fall of those who are quick to enforce it. Their pangs of conscience make them drop the stones and walk away one by one. What were they? A random gathering of sinful men who could not constitute a moral authority, and much less a legal tribunal. They did not correspond from any point of view to the legalistic principle they wished to apply. They would have been nothing more than a pack of murderers on the verge of committing a sin heavier than adultery, and Christ makes them understand this. As for the beneficiary of divine love and patience, she receives forgiveness and comfort, but above all the exhortation to sin no more. Did she respect this essential condition, which is ultimately the key to the entire episode? Perhaps she did. Perhaps she became a saint. But what if she did not? Then she would have found herself, after a while, in the same situation, with Christ no longer present to rescue her from the clutches of her accusers. And perhaps, in the event of a relapse, the Lord's attitude or judgment would have been different, for errare humanum est, perseverare diabolicum. What is certain is that no rigorous and definitive conclusion about the Christian legitimacy or illegitimacy of the death penalty can be drawn from this episode. One can only speculate upon it with a certain rhetorical skill. But how is it that explicit references to such an important issue, one that Christ himself would ultimately confront directly, and after him a long line of Christian martyrs, including most of the apostles, are missing from the Gospels? As a rule, the Savior did not pronounce himself, did not see fit to pronounce himself, upon two major categories of problems. On the one hand, those lacking importance in the order of Christian life and the economy of salvation, and on the other hand, those that were implied or self-evident. The death penalty can by no means fall into the first category, as it has enormous consequences both for those who are condemned and for those who condemned, as well as for the general psychomoral state of society. If Christ did not pronounce himself upon it, it is rather because he implied it to be a legal instrument necessary for social order in the sinful stage of the human condition. Someone might object, however, that if it were a matter of something implied, Christ might just as well have implied it to be inherently incompatible with his entire preaching. Minimal logic, however, forces us to conclude that if he had considered it truly and completely incompatible, that is precisely when he would have had all the more reason to pronounce himself clearly upon it, so as not to leave cause for scandal or stumbling. But some say perhaps Christ did pronounce himself on it at some point and somewhere, but the evangelists failed to record it, as they could not record everything. And there are also many other things which Jesus did and said, the which if they could be written every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that should be written. Yet why would all four canonical evangelists have overlooked Jesus' clarifications on such a grave matter, one under whose threat their Master himself stood for a long time, and which was indeed the very outcome of his earthly life? Let us be realistic. It is far more plausible to assume, placing the matter within the entire context of historical Christianity, that they considered it, just as Christ did, and as the later Holy Fathers did, a self-evident prerogative of the bearers of the sword, ordained to watch over the earthly city. To be aware by virtue of your status as a Christian that you do not have here a permanent city, but that your true city and citizenship is in heaven, by no means implies that you deny or disregard the laws or the order of the worldly city. This is exactly what it means to render unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. That this is so can also be seen from the fact that examining not only the Gospels, but also the other writings of the New Testament, we find the same silence on the issue that concerns us here, yet we gain certain reference points that justify the above interpretation. And the most relevant text remains Romans chapter 13 verses 1 to 6, which speaks of the prerogatives of those who do not bear the sword in vain, the governing authorities, magistrates and judges who enforce the laws in the city, the apparatus of the authority in general, fundamentally meant to be servants of God and man. The Holy Apostle Paul exhorts Christians to submission and respect toward the imperial authorities, just as Christ had previously exhorted, render unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. But things must be viewed with nuance, with the discernment of one who, in the light of the Spirit, does not fear them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, and indeed even sees a blessedness in being persecuted for righteousness' sake. In the Epistle to the Romans, the Apostle to the Gentiles, beyond his prudent care not to further incite imperial power against the first Christian communities, which were accused primarily of insubordination toward the deified Caesar, does not absolutize a state of affairs, but defends a principle. Indeed, principally speaking, hierarchy and authority are necessary to any order, whether spiritual or secular, and if there is a natural consensus on what is good, then performing it in and of itself spares you from any tension with the bearers of the sword, the official guardians of the established order. The Christian recognizes in principle that the purpose of power is to safeguard justice, and that, since justice is pleasing to God, he who truly safeguards it can be called, by this very fact, a servant of God, which is why God also permits him as such, consecrating his ministry. However, when Caesar insists on putting himself in the place of God, and when the things which are his systematically come into irreducible contradiction with the things that are God's, when the perversion of power voids the natural consensus on what is good, and its justice becomes arbitrary and discretionary, then it loses its foundational justification, becoming something displeasing both to God and to those subject to it. God may still permit it for a time to test mankind, but under these new conditions, the duty of the people becomes precisely to oppose Caesar in the name of God, even at the risk of their own lives, as did the first founders of the Christian Church, following Christ, the chief cornerstone. That it is not blind and ultimately indifferent submission, but rather, when necessary, sacrificial insubordination, assumed with full mystical responsibility, that constitutes the true Christian attitude in the face of the historical perversions of power. This is witnessed unto the ages not by Paul's word, but by his blood. More than to a direct submission to Caesar, the words of Christ point to the responsibility that every Christian bears toward the public life of the city, preventing the prejudice, yet so widespread to this day, that the religious person should have nothing to do with politics and history in general, but should instead adopt a kind of resigned autism toward the world in which they live. To be sure, Christianity is not in its essence a form of managing and ameliorating history, but a path toward transcending it. Christ's kingdom is not of this world, yet the road to heaven passes through earthly life, and salvation is either won or lost here. The end is beyond, but the way is here. Father Galerio used to remind us constantly. Moreover, we pass through the world with the responsibility not only toward ourselves, but also toward all the concentric community circles in which we are enmeshed: family, guild, community, nation, church. For the Christian politics is not an end in itself, and its stakes do not lie in worldly well-being. It is merely the fleeting framework for higher aspirations, which one is not permitted to compromise or thwart by dissolving them into the transience of immediate goals. To this, all Christians are called to watch over, without the illusion that the world could be transformed into paradise, but with the conviction that it can and must be prevented from becoming hell. As far as the death penalty specifically is concerned, the Pauline text, although sketching a reference framework for it, leaves it merely to be understood that it could fall among the prerogatives of the bearers of the sword, without recommending or contesting it as such. The text is not a validation of the supreme condemnation that secular justice can hand down, not without divine permission, for all things are in the final analysis given from above, but it leaves very little room for its invalidation. An undertaking that, moreover, no traditional authority ever engaged in, it being brought into question only alongside the inflation of the humanitarian ideas of modernity. We find nothing clearer in this regard in the books of the New Testament. There being insufficient scriptural indications, and with newer official theology prudently bypassing the issue, some expect to find support for their humanitarian democratic idealisms in the tradition of the Holy Fathers. Does patristic literature meet their expectations in this regard? From what I have managed to research, not at all, or far too little. But patristic literature is vast and only partially translated, so it is not impossible that there are some more substantial references on this topic somewhere that remain unknown. As a rule, this poor question is asked: did any Holy Father or prominent ecclesiastical writer support the necessity or legitimacy of the death penalty in the Christian world? It seems not. And it is no wonder it should be so, because, on the other hand, this was not the business of the Fathers or of ecclesiastical authorities in general, spiritual power not substituting itself for secular power, and, on the other hand, the death penalty, even when permitted or tolerated on account of the secular power or civil authorities, is not and cannot be a desideratum of Christianity or one of its hallmarks. Like God himself, the Christian desires the repentance of the sinner, not his death. It happens, however, that more than once the sinner, by virtue of his free will, contravenes holy expectations, both divine and human, not only committing sin but persisting in it, and by this he imperils not only his status as a member of the Church and his own salvation, but also the order and safety of the social body to which he belongs as a citizen. With this, he falls under the jurisdiction of the bearers of the sword, called to guard the order of the city. And the city, any city, has its laws, whose value resides not in their theoretical existence, but in their practical functionality. The law is made to be applied without concession. Where there is law, there is no bargaining. And the law that is not applied, or is applied inconsistently, abdicates as law, losing its reason for being. God's patience and forgiveness may be infinite, and it is not our business to estimate the measures and anticipate the verdicts of divine judgment, but human patience and forgiveness have their limits, subjective or objective, and legal coercion, from which we cannot dispense, is one of these limits, trans-individual in character, responding to the current needs of social existence. I, as a Christian, can forgive the sinner, but the law does not forgive him, or it forgives him once, but it does not forgive him infinitely. And the legal sanction is proportional to the gravity of the committed act, judged in its social consequences. If de jure the offender or criminal, that is, the sinner, become a social danger, is condemned by an external authority empowered to this effect, de facto he condemns himself in the sense that the offense or crime committed, that is, sin in the guise of social evil, is what draws upon him the condemnation prescribed by law. Here the Apostle is as clear as can be, and the Holy Fathers cannot judge otherwise. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. For he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doth evil. In conclusion, church and state, religious conscience and civic conscience, individual morality and public law, divine justice and human justice, however many points of tangency they may have, and they cannot but have them, are neither to be confused nor substituted for one another. And the saints are not to pronounce themselves with the exception of possible manifest deviations or abuses of secular power, upon the laws of the city or state, just as magistrates are not to pronounce themselves upon ecclesiastical dogmas. A less foolish question would be, did any Holy Father or important church writer from the first millennium, that of the undivided church and the imperial zenith of Christianity, rise against the death penalty, considering it an unchristian abuse of secular power? Again, it seems not. To the disappointment of contemporary humanitarians, the Fathers also remain silent on the death penalty, just as Christ, the Evangelists, and the Apostles did. And it is to be assumed that they did so for the very same reasons. So as not to prolong this more than necessary, I conclude that no one is stopping us from declaiming, if we absolutely insist, on the death penalty, expressing our personal agreement or disagreement. It is proper, however, to be more balanced in claiming Christianity as an ally to our ideological or sentimental inclinations, acquired instead within the ambience of a modernity at odds with both tradition and transcendence, realistically accepting at least two evident facts. One, that no major traditional Christian authority has pronounced itself definitively or even explicitly against the death penalty when applied legally, following a fair trial, by the authorized bodies of secular power, and two, that the death penalty has constantly figured in almost all Christian legislation for nearly 2 millennia. Might it not be that, just as it is said of some that they are more Catholic than the Pope, we are trying to seem more Orthodox than the saints? And might we not, by attempting to opportunistically adapt it to current slogans, be irreverent toward our own tradition?